Okay, well, I'm seeing our number level out here of attendees, so I think we'll go ahead and get started tonight. First of all, I just want to thank James and John for being here with us tonight. We're very excited to have you both. I am just gonna read a quick introduction and then I will let you two get to your conversation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Courtney. I'm the social media and events coordinator at Grassroots Bookstore in downtown Corvallis. And tonight we have authors James with us for his new book, On Assignment, a memoir of a National Geographic filmmaker. And he's joined in conversation by his son and fellow author, John Larison. James Larison is a retired university professor who spent most of his career on the faculty of Oregon State University, serving as a teacher, resident scientist, and university administrator. For most of that same period, he also produced, photographed, and wrote more than 30 films for National Geographic Society. John Larison was born in Oregon in 1979 and worked as a fly fishing guide and high school English teacher before turning full-time to writing. His most recent novel, Whiskey When We're Dry, was a Los Angeles Times and Seattle Times bestseller, an Indie Next Pick, and a finalist for the Ken Kesey Award and winner of the Will Rogers Medallion. It was named a best book by O Magazine, Goodreads, Entertainment Weekly, Outside Magazine, Powell's, NPR's All Things Considered, The Times United Kingdom, and others. He is James's son. Okay, so the way that this event is going to work is that James and John are going to be in a conversation for most of the event. And then in the last 10-15 minutes, we're going to have an audience Q&A. So please use the Q&A chat box designated down at the bottom in your toolbar to ask any questions you have for James or John. And then we'll use that to run the Q&A. And then shortly, I will be putting the link to buy On Assignment into the chat, as well as Whiskey When We're Dry. So we highly encourage you to buy both books from our bookstore. Not only will you be supporting James and John, you'll be supporting Grassroots as a local indie bookstore that can bring events like this to you. Okay, and without further ado, I'm going to let the two of you take it away.
Thank you, Courtney. It's so great to be here with you, Dad. Now that you're a famous writer, I don't get to see you enough. And before I ask you to read a few pages from the book, if you're willing, I thought I'd just give a plug to independent bookstores generally and Grassroots in particular. Not a lot of people know this, but independent bookstores really do a lot, not just to help readers in a local community, but also to help writers. If it wasn't for independent bookstores picking books and championing new books, the only place that would be selecting which books people read and buy would be Amazon. And we probably wouldn't have as many diverse stories as we get when independent bookstores are thriving. Also, when you support independent bookstores, about 40% of the money that you spent on the book stays right there in your local community, employs people, keeps the lights on downtown, and does good things. When you buy from a big place online that I won't even mention, Jeff Bezos goes to the moon, or close. So, okay, enough of that pitch. But Dad, I'm really, I'm not gonna be able to call you James Larison here tonight. I'm gonna just stick with Dad. But I was hoping, you could read some pages for us before I start asking you some questions that we have not rehearsed and that I do genuinely want to know the answers to.
First of all, I'd like to say that this is something new for me. Many of you grew up probably being taught that all the dinosaurs went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous period, but I'm living proof that that's just not true. And pretty soon you're going to figure that out all by yourselves. I'm going to read a section of the book from chapter 3. And to set the scene a little bit for you, chapter 3 occurs in Alaska. It's one of the first films that I had total control over, from funding to production. I was in Alaska to film these guys, the fur seals that occur in the Pribilof Islands way out in the middle of the Bering Sea. But part of the story dealt with the fact that fishermen compete with fur seals for food, and it's part of the limit that occurs to the population size. So we were on the edge of the Bering Sea near a little tiny town called Igigik. And when I say near, I mean like 10 miles away. We were in the wilderness, as closest to the wilderness as you can get in the world today. The Bering Sea was cold and miserable, and we were on the beach trying to film the fishermen capturing sockeye salmon, bringing them back to the beach, loading them into plastic tubs, which they call totes. And then all these World War II and Korean era aircraft, big cargo aircraft, would come in and land on the beach, load up with these totes, and then go back to the interior to have the fish processed. So I start this reading on page 28, where my friend and colleague whom I've hired, Jim Hicks, and I have talked our way into one of these airplanes. And the airplane is sitting on the beach preparing to take off in a period of time that's just before midnight. The sun is setting. Alaska, the land of the midnight sun, it never sets, but it's just down at the bottom. So here I go from page 28. It was 10 minutes before midnight. The sun was just off on our left, kissing the horizon. The sky was shifting from yellow to red and then to black as the light faded. Through the break in the black clouds, a ray of sunlight suddenly flashed across the beach, through the windshield, bathing us all in a bright yellow glow. The young pilot put on his aviator sunglasses, then pushed the twin throttles to the post, and the engines began to scream. The 40-year-old bucket of bolts began to take off roll. Instinctively, I began cycling through my lenses. First, the wide-angle lens, because it took in the whole cockpit. Next, the portrait lens, which captures expressions. When I look through the viewfinder of my camera, I see only the moving image, f-stops, focus, composition. I become invisible as if I were not part of the scene, but an observer of it. It never occurred to me that I should be afraid, because everything that happens in front of my lens appears to be happening to someone else. It is as if I were watching the pilots on a television screen rather than from the seat beside them. But of course, Jim Hicks and I were not watching the takeoff from the safety of our homes. We were a part of that scene. We had about 2,000 feet of usable flat beach ahead of us before the shoreline curved abruptly to the right. We would have to reach takeoff speed by the time we reached that turn. The throttles were now wide open. The engines gave as much as they could. The airspeed indicator began climbing through 20, 30, 40 knots. The sand was wet, the tires soft, the engines old. The plane had started out rolling north into a northwest wind, but it soon used up most of the straightaway beach, and still the Fairchild had not reached takeoff speed. A second passed, and then two. As the mass of aluminum roared down the beach, everyone's attention was riveted on the ocean ahead. 500 yards, 400 yards. Suddenly, the pilots were forced to turn to the right, to the northeast, hugging the shoreline. But as they turned away from the powerful wind, the airspeed indicator began to fall. The great airplane, loaded with fish, was moving too fast to make the corner, but too slow to take off, and we were in real trouble. The pilots were rapidly running out of options. The Fairchild was beginning to feel light. As weight came off the tires, we lost traction with the ground. The centrifugal force began driving us left toward the sea. The propellers were pulling as hard as they could to the right, but momentum was forcing us relentlessly left toward the waves. We had passed that do or die moment. It was too late to abort the takeoff. Faced with no other choice, both pilots, almost in unison, stepped hard on their left rudder pedals, turning the airplane sharply back toward the sea. They pulled on the yokes, and the nose of the great airplane rose reluctantly into the air, paying dearly for every foot of elevation. Its airspeed indicator dipped as the speed bled off, its engines screaming, the plane clawing for altitude as it sped out over the waves of the Bering Sea. In the cockpit, despite the enormous roar of the engines, it suddenly seemed very quiet. The young pilot's face said it all. In his years of flying passengers from Portland to Seattle, he had probably never run out of runway. There was nothing he could do. He seemed to freeze up. 1 second passed and then another, and by this time I had put down my camera, concentrating on the only thing that really mattered, the blur of water that flashed beneath the plane. Was it getting farther away, or was it coming up toward the landing gear? Was the plane climbing or stalling? We were a quarter of a mile out over the Bering Sea. The yokes were shaking violently in the pilot's hands. They were struggling to maintain some control over the airplane, but their efforts were sure to fail. They knew it, and because they could not hide their panic, I knew it also. The older pilot turned to me, his face nearly white. Over the engine's roar, he screamed, "We're going in." He turned back toward the windshield, his chin sank into his shoulders, and he locked his jaw as if to brace himself against the inevitable. My heart began pounding in my ears. I felt as if someone had hit me in the chest with a hammer. My heart ached, my arms tingled. Suddenly, the scene became very real. I could no longer pretend that this was happening only to the pilots in front of my camera. Whatever happened to them was going to happen to us as well. Jim and I had stumbled into someone else's nightmare. A very long instant passed, and then nearly at 100 miles an hour, the airplane shuddered as the nose wheel tore through the top of the first big wave. The airplane tripped as if it was an elephant running through mud. My camera slammed forward, hit the pilot's seat back, and was instantly torn from my now shattered, broken, and bleeding hand. The propellers knifed into the water, cold water crashed into hot engines. In a terrifying instant, Jim and I, the flight crew, perhaps 20,000 pounds of fish, and a now useless mass of twisted metal abruptly dove beneath the surface and instantly struck the bottom of the Bering Sea. The cockpit floor was shredded as the entire undercarriage of the airplane was torn out from underneath us. The twin tails of the plane kept coming forward. 10 tons of fresh fish flew forward, slamming against the bulkhead behind our heads. The wall that separated the cargo hold from the cockpit ruptured under the crashing force of the heavy load. The fisherman behind me flew over top of me and slammed into the instrument panel. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jim Hicks as he too disappeared into a tangle of metal. My chest slammed into the back of the pilot's seat, and my feet crashed down through what was left of the flight deck where the pilot's seat had been, through a jagged hole in the floor, trapping me in place. The cockpit was torn to pieces as it folded back under the massive fuselage. The crushing weight of the cargo continued to drive forward, slamming me against the instrument panel, but also somehow cushioning me from all the sharp edges and hard surfaces. The great weight of the cargo crushed me into smaller and smaller space. There was nothing to breathe but thick, smelly fish soup. I struggled to free myself, but was shackled to the floor, entangled in shredded aluminum, unable to move. We were all buried in dead fish, fighting for air, fighting for our lives. Just passing out would have been so easy, but adrenaline kept me mercilessly awake. Then, without warning, the cockpit walls tore open. The sides of the airplane opened to the sea. With the roar of the cargo, perhaps 5,000 fish rushed out into the ocean. Tons of salmon and a few people were ejected from gaping wounds in the nose of the airplane. Blood and body parts flushed into the dark water, and then it was silent. While I was drowning at the bottom of the Bering Sea, Elaine was 1,600 miles away at home in Oregon, struggling through her first pregnancy. At perhaps this most important moment in any young married couple's lives, the birth of their first child, she was alone, and I was struggling just to make it home to her. When I signed on to this way of making a living, this filmmaking life, I had not fully appreciated the costs or sacrifices we both would have to make. Every time I walked out that door on an extended film trip, Elaine would struggle to do the work of maintaining our home and family. alone in the woods in Oregon. When I returned from a trip, she would adjust to this itinerant visitor who was here one day and gone the next. She navigated around me, a single woman, for weeks and months at a time, then married again when I returned to take up residence. Somehow Elaine was not angry with me for my choices. She simply accepted me for what I was. In her words, driven. She would say, "You don't know when to quit." Elaine always sees the good in every situation. "You should stop sometime and smell the roses," she likes to say. At times I am so consumed by f-stops and camera angles and exposure latitudes of film, I don't really know what country I'm in, let alone what flowers might be growing under my feet. I see the world through tunnel vision, exactly as you might expect a person whose eye is constantly pressed up against the eyepiece of a camera. All that matters to a filmmaker is what comes through the lens. It's a strategy that may work for a photographer, but it can be disastrous when it comes to personal relationships. In fact, the fact that I still had such a strong relationship with my wife had more to do with her strengths than mine. At that moment, my strategy of living life through the lens of my camera seemed like a foolish choice. The Bering Sea was inside the cockpit. I was struggling for each breath in the few remaining air pockets. For those of us who had not been ejected, but had been trapped under the wreckage of the fuselage, the worst was yet to come. As quickly as the salmon flooded out of the cockpit, the sea roared back in. One moment I was drowning in fish, the next I was drowning in Arctic salt water. The airplane was now dead in the water. There was little hope my fate would be any better. I was 30 years old, and chances were I was not going to be getting any older.
Wow. Thank you for that.
Still makes me cry.
That's such a great passage for you to read, because I feel like it gives a good sense of one of the things this book does so well, which is like put us as readers in your shoes and in these hair-raising moments, but always also, balancing those moments against what's really at stake, which in this case isn't just your life, but was also, the future that you and mom were creating for yourselves and for me. I was the fetus in that passage. So I guess, this isn't a question I had prepared, but just in hearing you read, I'm really curious about the act of writing that scene. Clearly this is a terribly traumatic moment. And what is it like to go back to a real moment in your life and dwell in it in the way that you have to be able to bring a scene to life?
This was one of the more difficult things that I've ever done in my life. I never really dealt with these issues until I wrote them.
Yeah. Do you feel like writing those scenes was somehow cathartic?
Sure, I think it gives you the opportunity to evaluate who you are, how you think about things, how you deal with traumas in your life. And, it was a long process. It took almost 2 years to write this. And every time I revisited these sections that are like this in this book, it was like a massive therapy session for myself.
Incredible. Hey, I want to get to other sort of amazing events in your life that weren't as terrible as this one, but that are featured in the book. But before I do, there are just a couple questions I've kind of always wanted to know the answer to. And now that I have you in front of an audience, I get to ask. So now you're worried. In the book you write, you grew up rural poor. And I wonder, what did that really look like at the time? I haven't heard you talk much about that. And how do you feel like growing up poor in upstate New York, New England, shaped you as an adult?
Yeah, difficult question. I think that we tend to remember our childhoods more vividly than we remember many other things that happen later on in life. They get indelibly printed in your mind. So I remember the childhood growing up in this period of time right after the war. I was, one of the baby boomers that came along two years after the war. And I think the entire community was, by today's standards, poor. I mean, we had a house that was uninsulated. We had coal heat that we had to literally shovel down into the basement and into the furnace every morning to warm up the house. Elaine was brought up in a farm community next door to me, and they had no money even for clothing, and I mean, it was a tough time for, not just our family, but for most people at that time. Their material things were just so much less available. And so when I say we grew up rural poor, I don't mean to say that we were the poorest people in town. The whole town was like this. We were a rural community, and there just wasn't much money.
So before you started making films for National Geographic, you were making films as a young professor at Oregon State University, and I guess I'm curious about how you went from that rural poor upbringing, shoveling coal in the mornings, to landing a professorship out in Oregon. Specifically here. Mostly I'm interested in how you got into filmmaking. How does a kid who grew up in that situation come to decide, what I want to do? I want to make films. That seems like such a sort of far-fetched dream. And I'm curious how that dream came to be.
Well, I was really fortunate. I grew up 10 miles from Cornell University. And at the time, Cornell seemed like the logical choice, just like growing up here, you would think Oregon State or the University of Oregon is the logical choice for you. I had that choice. I took it. I was attracted immediately to the wildlife department, got a degree in wildlife. But then along the way, I kind of decided that I didn't really want to spend all of my life doing hard research. I thought that the need and that my set of talents existed on the edge of that, helping people to understand what all that science was about. And so I went to the University of Wisconsin and entered a journalism department. And I just sort of fell into this old German filmmaker. I saw his work. I loved his work. I said, this is for me. I made myself indispensable to the man for about 5 years. And he taught me everything that I know about light and how to use light, how to portray it, how to use it to create an illusion of a third dimension in a two-dimensional medium. And I just took to it like you need to if you're going to, choose a career that you're going to spend 30, 40 years at. And so the University of Wisconsin offered me the opportunity to make my first film as a master's degree project. My second film was funded by the Environmental Protection Agency and was a film about what do we do with all these wild open dumps scattered across the world, and we needed to transition to a more cleanly way of handling waste. And then I applied for jobs all over the US to get into a faculty position, and Oregon State offered that to me, right out of the box.
So after the plane crash, the film you made, at least in the telling of the book, it feels like that's really a turning point for your filmmaking career. That film comes out, and it's not long after that you get your big break with National Geographic. And I remember being a kid and traveling around, this really just incredibly privileged upbringing to go to these places with you. And every place we would go, and I would, or even if we were home and I said what you did, these grown-ups would come to me and ask, how did he get that job? How did that happen? And so I imagine there are people in the audience who have that same curiosity. How did you go from making films for Oregon State University to suddenly being a filmmaker for National Geographic? Can you tell us about your big break?
Well, I made 2 films for Oregon State University. One we don't talk about at all in the book, about the Columbia River, and the other one, this one, about these marine mammals. And they did pretty well on the national circuits of films at the time. They were picked up for national broadcast by the PBS system. They were seen by millions of people. They won some pretty substantial awards, and it caused some people to pay attention. And one of the people who paid attention was a woman by the name of Nada Yolen, who was in Washington, D.C. She happened to be responsible for funneling money to my program at Oregon State University. And she said, I have somebody I want you to meet. And it turned out that this person that she wanted me to meet was the executive producer of the television program, or the television division of the National Geographic. And it was that introduction which made all of this possible. Without that introduction, I never would have been able to get through the door of the National Geographic Society in the first place, even though I think the films that I had made were worthy. I think it's just very difficult to get into an organization like that. And so that's how it happened.
Can you I think most people now, when they think of a film getting made, they just automatically think of a digital camera, and maybe they think of a film camera. But I remember us having so many bags anywhere we traveled. Could you just describe like the gear that making these films in the 80s and 90s required you to pack around the world?
Yeah, gear was a big thing. And it's, of course, one of the reasons why you can't do this kind of thing for your whole life, because you just can't carry around that much gear when you're 50, 60 years old. But filmmaking involved an enormous pile of expensive gear. When we would travel, I remember the first world tour really that I took was for a NOVA program that I made called Farmers of the Sea. And we had to hit about 7 different countries in the Asian theater. And we carried 10 camera cases everywhere we went. And each one of them weighed in excess of 50 pounds. They included lead-lined cases for cameras and lead-lined cases for film, and then there are lights, and then there are all kinds of accessories and power converters, and you just name it. Our house still today is loaded with camera gear that is obsolete now, but nevertheless cost as much as the house itself. So
probably not worth that much anymore.
Oh, probably not. Probably the world has very little use for old film makers.
So I before I ask my next question, I'll just let people know that at the bottom of the screen in the toolbar, you'll see a Q&A box. And if you have any questions for Jim, feel free to write your questions in there. And at the end of our conversation, we'll be getting to those questions and lobbing those at Jim. And if you want to ask me a question, you can write one there as well. Okay, so I have to admit, one of the great pleasures of reading this book for me, and maybe also one of the great terrors of reading the book for me, was getting the straight dope on some of the stuff that happened to you. I grew up with the clean versions of some of these events. And there's one moment in particular that I was hoping you could describe for people who haven't read the book yet. And this event happened on a little island called Heron Island in in Australia. It's on the Great Barrier Reef. And just to set the scene for you, this is like a 1 mile long sand spit out in the middle of the ocean. From it, you can't see any land. There's no place to land an airplane or a helicopter or anything like that there. The only way to get to it was a very long boat ride. I think I remember the boat ride being like 6 or 8 hours long. And just to give you a sense of how remote this place was, Dad, I don't know if you remember this, but at one point I was 7 when we were there. My brother Ted was 4, and Ted and I were playing on in the water, and I slipped and cut my foot on coral. Which, you know, if that happens to you in Sydney, Australia, you know, no big deal. You can get antibiotics if you need them, you know. But where we were, there are no doctors, no antibiotics. And you were so worried about my foot getting infected in this, you know, remote place that you had Mom sit on me. You had Ted hold my arms down, and you boiled a wire brush in boiling water and then scrubbed my wound to abrade it and make sure it bled and got all the bacteria out. Just a harrowing moment. I feel like that, I'd like to ask you a lot more questions about that experience, but I won't. On this island though, I remember this day when it was kind of stormy out, and you and Mom went out in a boat. Ted and I were on the island kind of watching you, waiting for you to come back. When you came back, you were both just white-faced. And I remember asking what happened, because I could sense that something had happened. And you said, "We saw a shark." And now reading your book, I know that that was kind of an understatement. Could you let readers in on this day in the life of Jim Larison?
Well, this was a really stormy day, and we were trying to return a bunch of corals that we had taken and put in a laboratory to film close-ups back to the coral reef, and we were planting them in the reef exactly where we had taken them out a couple of days earlier. But it was a stormy day, and I went into the water with this bucket of corals and went down to 25 feet where I'd gotten this coral, and I was planting it right where it needed to be to grow. And all of a sudden I was just hit in the back by something enormous, and it grabbed a hold of my tank and yanked my tank up, and the first stage of the regulator, the part that attaches to the tank, hit the back of my head, pulled my face mask off. And, you know, I had no idea what I was hit by. And so I repositioned my mask and cleared it and tried to look around, seeing what in the world that was. And it was gone. And then it suddenly occurred to me that I had read somewhere that sharks often, before they attack a food, they often bump it because they can smell through their skin. So they would bump, and sometimes people say this is a bump and bite. And in fact, this shark had bit my tank and yanked it up over my head, and it was gone. And I remember that sharks like to come in underneath their target and turn upside down. So I stayed on the bottom, and I went over to this coral wall, and I melted it into the coral wall, trying to, you know, keep, because I can't see behind me, you know, or the sides. And so I hid as best I could in the folds of the coral. And all of a sudden, these two headlights come at me through the gloomy gray ocean. And that's a tiger shark, you know, and he's 12 feet long, easily 800 pounds, and he's coming right straight for me. And all I see are these yellow eyes, black rings. And I say, oh, you know, this is really it. How do I get to that boat up there 25 feet away without this shark? And so I stayed on the edge of this reef, scared to death, and the shark started circling me and the bommy and circling closer and closer and closer. And I finally decided my only hope was to use the dull knife that I had been using to clear away a spot for the coral to plant it. And there's no way that I was arm strength underwater, could possibly injure that shark by going through its skin. So I decided the only thing I could do was stab it in the eye. And, and, you know, by this time, the shark was close enough that you could do that. He was right there. And I knew that in any instant, he was just going to turn and take me. And so I stabbed at his eye and I missed, but it scared the shark. He hadn't expected to get this jab right next to his eye. And he took off into the water and I took off to the boat. And I cleared the water with all that heavy gear on, 10-pound weight and 45-pound tank and all the gear and everything, just cleared the edge of the boat and landed in the bottom of the boat just as the shark hit the shaft of the motor and drove the boat up into the air about 3 feet and threw water all over us. And I just laid in the bottom of the boat, white as a sheet. And I realized, if that shark really wanted to, that boat was no protection at all. So I started the engine and tore into shore. And I remember for days afterward, I couldn't get in the water. I was just staring at the water, feeling my legs to see if they were still there. But I decided on the way back in not to tell my kids about it.
Well, thank you, because we still got in the water a lot after that, I remember. I'm curious, like in that scene that you read for us in the beginning, you talked about how the act of filming was one where you became invisible, where you were, looking through the viewfinder and seeing these scenes unfold as if you weren't part of them. That seems like such a different creative headspace than the creative headspace of writing a book, especially a memoir, in which really the camera is totally turned on yourself. What was the process like going from a career of making yourself invisible to suddenly working for years on a book where you are really the subject?
This is a really, really difficult transition for me because my entire life I've been an observer of things. And I tried as a filmmaker not to interfere with what was in front of the camera and happening in front of the camera, whether it was a bird or a shark or whatever. I tried not to interfere with people. I tried to observe and film. And transitioning to writing any book, but especially a memoir, was very difficult. I remember I started writing this 10 years earlier, and I just totally muffed it because my desire to stay separate and observe made me think I had to write this as if it was happening to someone else, as if it was a novel. And I just miserably mishandled it. And I didn't have the skills and I wasn't able to make that work. And so I put it on a shelf for a long, long, long period of time until your daughter, my granddaughter, told me that I needed to write this book. She was so curious about all the stories and all the things that happened. And she finally convinced me that I needed to write this book. And so I, the rest of the story. I relied on my best-selling author's son to teach me how to write. And that was a long process too, in which there were a lot of moments when your skill set I had to absorb your skill set into an environment that wasn't suited for it, really. One that was a journalist, not a writer of a memoir.
From my vantage point, though, your skills as a photographer had trained you to pay attention in a way that I think made your journey to writing the book happen much faster. In other words, you already had a sense of like how to convey that third dimension in a way. And I feel that in the page when I read the book. There, you know, so many moments where my heart pounds because I'm in the scene with you, and it's such an exciting book to read just on that level. So you know, on a related question, and before I ask it, I'll remind people, if you want to ask questions, go ahead and write them in the Q&A box. How do you feel like the act of writing this book changed you?
I think that through writing a book like this, where you're really looking at every last aspect of how you grew up through to how you got to where you are, is a really valuable thing to do, because you do have to self-evaluate everything. You have to put everything in perspective to, why did you do this? Why didn't you, how did you nearly muff things? How did you do things right? And it was a long process. You kept telling me that, this would take years, and I kept, no, I can do it a lot faster than that. But of course you were right. It does take a long time to, wrap your head around where you've been, where you're coming from, why you came there, how you got there, and what's important about it. And lastly, what would anyone else reading it want to know about that situation? And I'm not sure I answered your question, but I answered my own.
Well, I think you got it. I've got one last question for you. And this is something that, that I've thought about. I've been curious about. Your career took you all over the world. You were traveling, multi-months of every year, going to these incredible places, most of them off the radar. And, having these experiences that were so not tourist experiences. You were hanging out with locals, you were interviewing locals, you were being taken to the favorite places of these locals. And now, in retirement, though you have traveled and gone to exciting places, your interest in retirement really seems to be staying in a place. Of course, at home, outside of Corvallis, but then also this cabin that you and Mom built in the Wallowa Mountains. And I'm curious, if you can explain why it feels important to you to return to this place in the mountains in Eastern Oregon multiple times a year, instead of traveling the world.
I think that going literally nonstop for 30 years around the world gave me the opportunity to see ecosystems and see environments that really span the whole globe, everything from deserts to high mountains to coral reefs to just about, rainforests and everything. And what I learned in the process of doing this was that I'm most comfortable and most at home in mountain terrain, in the alpine environment. And so I've sought that out and spent much of my retirement time in that environment, whether it's climbing mountains, climbing ice, building a cabin in the mountains to retreat to. What I also simultaneously had to get away from was all of the stresses of traveling. And so I sought out ways of doing these things relatively close to home, so that I can spend maximal amount of time, in a cabin in the mountains and minimal amount of time sandwiched in the cabin of an airplane. I'm tired of airplanes.
That seems like a great bookend to our beginning right there.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe I have a reason for being tired of airplanes.
Hey, thank you for answering my my questions here. And I'd love to turn to audience questions now.
Yeah, we do have a good amount of questions for you guys here. I'll start with the first one that came through from Gray Larison. Guessing he's a family member. Elaine plays a big part in your career as a filmmaker. What part did she play in helping you write your story?
Elaine has an enormously well-defined desire to remain anonymous. And she has a hard time putting herself out there in any form. So she has had a very hard time with me writing about her and about her involvements in all of this. Nevertheless, she's played an absolute key role in helping me to, behind the scenes, helping me to shape what is said and how it was said. And, you know, she was integral to the writing of most everything from first draft to final draft.
That's awesome. You have a very supportive family. It's very cool. You have a question from someone named Yvonne. And they asked, do you have a favorite film out of all the ones that you and Elaine made?
I think my favorite film out of all the films we made was the one called Ancient Forests. And we shot it entirely, or almost entirely, in Alaska. And we lived in the Alaskan ancient forests of the Tungus there. And it was one of the most unique environments I think I've ever seen or lived in. And we lived there for long enough that we were really attached to it. And it was a difficult environment to work in because it was raining every single minute of every single day and night. That's kind of hard on a camera and kind of hard on cameramen and their children. But nevertheless, I think the sum total of everything we did, that film stands out to me as being one of the more formative ones. Very
cool. Alaska is somewhere I've always wanted to go and have not gotten to yet. You have a question from Jerome. Was Elaine surprised by any of your stories, or did she remember any of them differently?
That's a good question. I don't think I can answer that. I think that we share most everything as we go along every single day. So I don't think much of this was a surprise to her, or maybe the fact that I finally dealt with it was a surprise to her, but I don't think it was a surprise in any real sense in terms of what I wrote about.
Okay. Janet asks, do you have a favorite film and or location that stands out? I think you kind of answered this, but looking back after all these years.
I think some of the films that we made at high elevation have spoken to me, you know, at a different level, at a really gut level. Elaine and I have spent many trips into the high alpine environment on ice. We're members of the Canadian Alpine Club, and we participate in their backcountry events over the years, and we've stayed in their chain of huts across the whole Rocky Mountain corridor, and those have all been, you know, so meaningful to us. And so, you know, that at elevation, when you're standing on a glacier that extends for 20-30 miles in all directions, it's a really neat place.
Okay. Nathan is the next person who's asking a question. During the writing process, did you find yourself rewatching your own films to fill in details or jog your memory or reassess an experience? If so, were there any surprises or unexpected realizations?
As a matter of fact, as I began writing this film, the first or almost first thing I did was go back and look at all of our films. And partly I was going after what did I say when I wrote these films, because I wanted to capture in each of the chapters the essence of what a film was about. But I also needed to jog my memory in terms of, where did we go for this film and where did we go for that film? Because we've been to so many places over so many years that, a lot of that was at one point kind of jumbled together. And I had to do a lot of research and looking back at our field logs, and the films were a major source of that jogging of my memory. There's a scene in one of our first films, Riches from the Sea, we're caught in a feeding frenzy of sharks coming through and eating these schooling fish. And I had completely forgotten all about this event. And so watching the film again was like, oh yeah, I remember that. Sharks coming within 1, 2, 3 feet of us and with their mouths wide open, grabbing these bait fish. So yeah, it helped a lot to watch all these films and to see all that again.
Okay. Mary Lou asks, well, first they said, I first met Jim when he became OSAU Director of Sea Grant Communications, and you were excellent. Since then, you have made award-winning films, raised 2 talented kids, done a PhD in ornithology, and now written an incredible book. What has given you the greatest joy, and what will be the next chapters?
I think one of the things that this book helped me articulate in my own mind was just how important all of the little steps along the way in terms of the construction, the building of our family was concerned, and how important it was that we took our kids literally to every place that we could realistically expect that they could exist and be safe, and at the same time experience the world. And this process by which over 30 years we involved our kids in everything we did, I think was the process that I remember most fondly, and so forth. I think it's important. I went back and got a PhD later in life because I felt like I never really got to finish that education process, and that was important to me and will probably contribute in some way to my next book.
Okay. I have a question actually for both of you, but also John. So your childhood, I mean, you were raised in all these really cool places, seeing all these cool things. What was that like, childhood on the road? Were you homeschooled? How did that, work for you? And how did that kind of develop you as a writer now?
That's a great question. Just logistically, often we traveled during my brother and I got to come during those 3 months of summer. But when the trips were during the school year, my mom would bring curriculums, and in addition to being an assistant cameraman and sometimes a sound engineer, she would also be our teacher, homeschooling us. I look back on all of these things just so fondly, and sometimes I can't believe that I survived things that I survived. And also looking back, I really savor the connections that we got to make, not just with local people and places we went, but often my parents would bring someone along, like Michelle Mate is someone who, used to come. She's about 10 years older than my brother and I, and we just became like siblings. You know, she's like our big sister still. And those are like just deep connections that were forged in these places. In terms of writing, a novelist has to be on the fringes of society in a way in order to be able to look back and see things differently. And so definitely growing up in that way was, you know, just an essential building block for me in my writing career. Yeah, great question.
Thank you. Looks like we're here at the last couple minute marks. I want to thank both of you for being here with us tonight. James, we're so excited to, you know, have your book in store. John, we have your book in store already. And I just want to note for the audience, we are still waiting for our shipment of James's memoir in store, but you're welcome to place online orders. You're welcome to call in and reserve a copy. And then luckily James is going to stop in and sign some of those. So you can put in the instructions field on our website to ask for a personalization. And James can come in and sign the book to you, or if you want to give it as a gift, you can make those notes. And then he will pop by and sign those. And we will then also have them in store. So you're welcome to come in and browse them as well. We also have Whiskey While We're Dry here in store right now, which John, you are welcome to come in and sign stock copies if you would like, or personalized copies. And on that note, I just want to thank you again, James and John, for, you know, coming to this event with us with Grassroots Bookstore. We really appreciate it. And we're so happy to, you know, support your writing and have your books in store.
Thank you so much.
Both John and I are very happy to be here, and we really appreciate Grassroots for all of its support throughout the years for John's books and mine. And we're very happy to have this relationship develop.
And I'd just like to say thank you to the audience. Great questions. Thanks for being here. It's been fun for us.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining tonight. We appreciate your attendance. We couldn't have awesome events like this without you guys here. So thank you. And I think with that, we will sign off for the night. Yeah. Bye.